Well, hello everyone. Today we have with us Chris Helzer. He is the Nebraska Director of Science and Stewardship with the Nature Conservancy and is a prairie enthusiast and a native Nebraskan. Chris, thank you so much for your time and joining our class. I will just let you take it away. We are all very excited to hear what you have to tell us about your work
Awesome.
in the prairies.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So I want to talk about grasslands. My job with the Nature Conservancy involves doing science as a researcher, overseeing a lot of our land management, but I also do a lot of outreach and I talk a lot about prairies and why they're important, why they're interesting. So I'll start with that, and I just want to kind of bring everybody up to speed on why prairies are interesting. I think most people, when they think about grasslands or prairies, they think about something like this photo, which is pretty boring looking. It's just a bunch of grass. It's flat. Who cares? Why would you go there? But when you look closely at prairies, or if you go out at the right times of year, there's a lot happening, and that's what I want to talk about. Um, but you have to look closely a lot of times to see
Wow.
most of what's happening in prairies. It's happening at a very small scale, and if you get down on your hands and knees, or just even stoop down a little bit, you can see this whole world open up in front of you. On the other end of the spectrum, you can see skies in grasslands like no other place because the horizon extends from the end of the earth to the other end, it looks like. And it's a great place to see sunrises and sunsets. And I'm a photographer, and so I like to take pictures of both the small and the large things, which is what I'm showing you today. Prairies are full of different kinds of birds that you don't see in places with a lot of trees. They nest right on the ground. Some of them, like upland sandpipers, are actually shorebirds that evolved to live along wetlands, but then evolved again to live in grasslands and build nests right on the ground out in the middle of grasslands. You got things like sharp-tailed grouse and prairie chickens that are, large birds that live in big groups. Excuse me. There's a lot of reptiles and amphibians, things like box turtles or garter snakes. A lot of small mammals that live sort of down in the vegetation, where again, you're not going to see them very often, but they're there and they're really important. And they're the food source of a lot of larger animals like badgers, coyotes, things like that. And of course, we don't have these in a lot of prairies anymore, but bison and other large grazers have always been an important part of prairies and grasslands. They're also stinking cute when they're little. But I focus a lot on insects and other invertebrates because that's where a lot of the diversity of species are in grasslands, and that's where a lot of the function happens for prairies as well. So things like butterflies and bumblebees, little things like this. This is a bee species that specializes on one kind of flower. It's the blue sage bee. It feeds only on pitcher sage or blue sage, which is the flower that it's on here. It's a really unique little species that it's part of this huge diversity of bees and other life in prairies. Um, if you took all the bison in a prairie and weighed them, and then took all the ants in the same prairie and weighed them, they would weigh the same. The biomass of ants is immense
Oh
in
my.
prairies, under prairies. It's the staggering number of insects out there. And the same applies to grasshoppers, by the way. The biomass of grasshoppers and the biomass of bison are the same on a prairie. There's things like cicadas and plant hoppers and assassin bugs that are major predators. We're just full of this diversity in life, right? And then I want to transition to talking about land stewardship because all of that life in prairies doesn't exist without people and hasn't for the life of these prairies. And what I mean by that is two things. One, if you look across all the ecosystems of the world, the vast majority of them have had a very long relationship with human stewardship. People have been managing those very intentionally and very thoughtfully for up to 30,000 years in certain places. In the central part of the US, the prairies that we have here, when the last ice age ended and the glaciers receded, this area started out as a spruce forest and then transitioned into grassland as a combination of both climate effects, but also largely because of people and their management, especially their use of fire. So indigenous people have been using fire in this landscape for 8 to 10,000 years. That use of fire plus a lot of other things that they did, again, very intentionally, has shaped these prairies into what they are today. And the responsibility that we have today continues to be managing those prairies. The choice is not, do we manage these prairies or do we stay away from them? If we stay away from them, they turn into something else. They degrade, they lose their diversity, they lose their value. Um, so the question is, how do we manage these and what do we aim for? And I'll talk about some of that here in a minute. But I wanted to point that out because I think it's a really important piece of this story, which is that nature is not something that is better off without humans almost anywhere in the world. That just doesn't work that way. We rely on each other, and it's just a question of how we manage that relationship. So we still burn prairies today. We still use fire as one of our management tools. One of the things that happens when you burn a prairie is that you get rid of a lot of the old vegetation, the layer of thatch on the ground that shades and cools the soil, and you open it up so that plants can really grow fast and lush. When you do that, that attracts grazing animals. So one of the reasons that indigenous people burned, one of many reasons, but one of the big reasons was to attract bison and other large animals because they knew if they burned a patch of prairie, that's where those bison were going to come and graze the following year because the vegetation is the most nutritious in those places. And we use that today, both with bison and with cattle, as a way to focus the grazing effects of these large animals in different places of the prairie each year. And we can burn a different place each year so that they don't graze the same area over and over.
May
And
I ask a question
yes,
about the
please.
previous image? So for this one, why are is this because of burning that the parcels are looking different?
Yes, thank you. Yes, right. So there's no fences in this picture. The cattle are all on the green area because that was the area that was most recently burned. And you can see that that's really short because the cows are keeping it grazed down short. But everything that wasn't burned, the cows walk through it a little bit, but they don't do a lot of grazing there. So it's tall and thick.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this and other ways of managing grasslands is we want to create different kinds of vegetation structure in those grasslands. So in that picture that I showed before, there's you can see two of those here, one that's really short and sparse and one that's tall and dense. But there's a lot of other variations of that. And each of those is important from a habitat standpoint. So, for example, there are different plant species that you're going to find in each of these examples of different habitat that are driven by fire and grazing and combinations of the two. And the same applies to bird species. There are bird species that are going to nest in areas that are really short, like in the middle here. There's areas that are going to be sort of the medium height, and there's areas that'll be in the really tall and dense. And if you don't have all three of those types of habitat, you're not going to have all of those bird species in that prairie. So it's really important to have a variety of those different types of habitats. And then there are some bird species like sharp-tailed grouse and bobwhite quail that move back and forth between those habitats. They might nest in one and take their kids to feed in another one and then overwinter in a third one. And so that variety is important for some species all the way across. Okay. Other things that are fun about land management are there are these cascading effects of the work that we do as land managers. And I want to give you a couple of quick examples of that. So this is a species of plant called Canada milkvetch. It is a plant that is really, really attractive to grazing animals. And so when you have a prairie that's being grazed, that plant, which you can see in the foreground here, usually is very short because the cows in this case, or bison would do the same thing. They keep grazing it over and over and over. And you think, oh, that doesn't sound like it's a good thing for that plant. But they don't do it every year because we're burning in different places. And so this plant, when it flowers, there's an insect species that is attracted to the flower and it burrows inside those flowers and it lays eggs. And when that plant produces pods, the larvae of those insects feed on the seeds that are developing inside those pods, and they can eat pretty much all the seeds on that whole plant, which means that plant is producing no seeds at the end of the year. That is bad for the plant. But when that plant gets grazed, it breaks that cycle because those insects that feed on the seeds, they overwinter then below that plant. So they come out of those pods, they come out of those little holes in the pod there, they dive down into the soil and they live there for the winter. And then the next year they just crawl right up the plant and they start that process again. But in a year where it gets grazed off and it's not allowed to flower, those insects have to go somewhere else And then when the next time that plant flowers after the grazing, there's no insects around, and so it can actually produce a whole bunch of seeds. So the grazing interacts with the flower species to sort of make sure that the insect, which is important also, doesn't eat all the seeds every year from that plant. Another example is this is a site that we had burned in the spring. The cattle grazed it all summer. The grasses here in this photo are species that should be 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall, but they're not because they've been grazed over and over all season. And they're now brown because it's been a hot, dry summer and they've just given up trying to grow because they've been grazed off so many times. They've lost a lot of energy. They're not dead, they're just going dormant for the year. And I'm going to show you now a photo of the next year. So this is the same place a year later. And what you see here is those grasses are back, but they're not very tall because they lost a lot of energy the previous year from the grazing. And it's going to take them a couple years to regain all of that energy, which means right now they're not as competitive as they normally are. And because they're not as competitive, there's open space for all these other plants to thrive in a way that they normally don't because those grasses are so dominant if they're not grazed off. And so last year's grazing has created this incredible diversity of wildflowers the following year. This is a photo of an area in the same prairie that didn't get grazed the previous year. And it also looks good, but it's very different, right? So here, the grasses are very tall. They're 6, 7 feet tall in places. There's a different set of wildflowers. And so you have a different kind of diversity in each of those three different examples. The area that's being grazed, the area that was recently grazed, and the area that hasn't been grazed for a while. They're all important, but they all have different features to them. And that's important for things like pollinators, because pollinators each have their different favorite plants to feed on, but also they need a variety of plants to feed on so that they can keep themselves fed through a longer season. Each flower only blooms for a few weeks normally, right? And they all have different kinds of nutritional value. So something like a bee really benefits from having multiple species of flowers in the same area so they can pick the best food for them and their kids. And then because there's lots of pollinators, that means there's lots of food for the predators that rely on those pollinators as food. And those predators also help regulate populations of all the different insects out there. So the whole system sort of relies on that diversity, which is created by the diversity of flowers, which is created by the grazing, which is caused by the management that we as humans are choosing to do. And then another example, this is a species of thistle. It's a native thistle species. It's called tall thistle. It's an annual, meaning that it germinates and grows and flowers in the same year and then it dies. Thistles are really important. Some of them are noxious weeds, but the native thistles are really important to the ecology of prairies because they're really valuable for pollinators. They make incredible amounts of nectar and pollen. Monarch butterflies use tall thistle in particular during their migration each fall as a really important resource. But also, because they're so attractive to those pollinators, there are lots of predators that hang out on them, which is good for the predators. And thistles in particular are valuable to goldfinches. So goldfinches are a type of native species of bird that they actually nest later in the season than a lot of their other bird species around them because they feed their kids thistle seeds. So they have to wait until the thistles are ready to bloom, and then they build their nest and they lay their eggs, and then they can harvest those seeds to feed to their kids. Sometimes they also will build their nest. So here's one that just pulled a seed out. They'll also build their nest in thistles sometimes because why not? You just live right where the food is, right? So if you look closely at this photo, there's actually a nest of goldfinches right there in the thistle plant. And so these birds now have this strong tie with this thistle, but this thistle doesn't grow and bloom without something that knocks that grass dominance back, like fire or grazing. So again, it ties back to humans and our management. If we weren't managing these prairies, these thistles would never grow and bloom and goldfinches wouldn't have anything to eat. So I say all that to introduce this preserve stewardship team, which is a big part of what I do for my job. So I oversee this team that manages a couple different sites that the Nature Conservancy owns. And one of the main focuses of our work is to come up with new ideas for how to manage grasslands that are good for biodiversity, are good for habitat varieties like we're talking about, but also can be used by the ranchers and farmers that manage most of the state. So we're trying to innovate, come up with new ideas, show people how they work, and then I communicate that out. All of us do communicate that out to other people. So the two sites that we work with are the Niobrara Valley Preserve and the Platte River Prairies. Niobrara Valley Preserve is really big. It's 56,000 acres. It's about the same footprint as the city of Lincoln, except it's stretched out along the river. So it's a very large area. We have a whole bunch of bison up there, a bunch of cattle grazing. And then the Platte River Prairies is a lot smaller. It's out on the Central Platte River, west of Grand Island. It's part of the area that the sandhill cranes come through every spring. But it also has a lot of variety of habitats. And we do a lot of prairie restoration there, where we take cropland and turn it into prairie with, hundreds of plant species in it.
So I had a question about these sites. Maybe
Yeah,
some of our students would too. Is that when uh, the Conservancy owns these sites, so were
right.
you able to get them through you know, I don't know, donations slash purchases from people around the area, like operations?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all the land here was purchased from the landowners beforehand. They came to us and offered to sell their land, or we approached them and offered to buy it. Um, and the money was funded from donations, from grants. Yeah, we raise money in lots of different
Right.
ways to do our conservation work. Yep.
I see. Got it.
Yep. Yeah, good question. Okay, so the way that we're trying to use these sites to change the world is that we're trying to have an influence on the way land is managed outside of our own sites, right? So in Nebraska, you probably know, maybe you don't, 97% of Nebraska is owned by private individuals, right? So conservation in Nebraska, if it's going to happen on the land, it's going to happen on private land. And so we need to be influencing the way that land management happens.
Mhm.
Ranchers are a big audience for us because they're the ones that are doing the grazing on all these sites. And ranchers are different than farmers. Farmers, row crop farmers, sometimes have cows, um, but they also have a lot of networks, and there's a lot of communication networks within those farmers that don't exist with ranchers.
Mhm.
Ranchers tend to be like these independent cusses that like want to live out on their own. They sometimes talk to each other, but it's hard to talk to a lot of ranchers all at once. But there are some groups of people who do talk to ranchers, and there are these habitat advisors. There are people who work for the NRCS, which is a USDA, Department of Agricultural agency. There's University Extension. There's Pheasants Forever. There's Fish and Wildlife Service that all have employees that go out and work with these private landowners and help them come up with new ideas of managing their land that are good for habitat, but also really good for making money, right? They have to make money on these properties to pay their taxes and to raise their kids and all the other things that you use money for. So, one of the ways that we think about our work is through this graph that I'm going to show you. This is uh, from the theory of the diffusion of innovation. It's an old thing that was developed in the 1960s as a way to capture how new ideas sort of move into the world and are adopted by people. And the idea is, really briefly, you've got innovators that come up with these new ideas. You've got early adopters who are always looking for new ideas to try. And then you've got like the early and late majority of people who at different times will grab onto these new ideas as after they've been out for a while and have been proven. And you've always got some laggards at the end who like they wait as long as they possibly can, right? What's interesting about this theory is that there's a critical mass at some point that is reached, and it's probably different for every idea, but the point is that you don't have to influence a majority of people before an idea becomes the normal thing and becomes accepted and is on sort of a trajectory that's going to get to 100%. You have to get to about 15 to 20% usually of the population that accepts this new idea and says this is now the way to do it, and then everybody else sort of falls like dominoes. So I bring this up because as we think about the work that we do to influence land management, we see ourselves as innovators, right? We're trying to work on the edge. We're not, our jobs and our livelihoods don't depend on every idea of ours working like it does for a rancher. So we can take a lot of chances and try and be an experimental group. Those early adopters, some of those are the habitat advisors that we work with, people with University Extension, somebody with the NRCS, who is working with landowners, and they're looking for new ideas to share with these landowners. Excuse me. And so, and then there are always the ranchers who are looking for new ideas, right? So we work a lot with those people. That's our primary audience for our new ideas. We don't try to work with all the ranchers out in the Sandhills or across Nebraska because there's too many of them. It's hard to work with a lot of them, but we can focus on the ones that we can think will influence others, and that's how we make our ideas get out into the world. And then the majority of people, it's some, not all habitat advisors are the experimental ones, right? So we got to work with the ones that are looking for new ideas. They'll influence the other ones. And also with ranchers, some ranchers would love to try new ideas, but they can't afford to take chances because they've got a mortgage and they've got a loan and they've got to keep the bank happy. So they have to convince the bank that their new idea is a good one. People who are not in debt, who don't have a mortgage on their land, have a lot more flexibility. And so they're often in that early majority. So they are also an important part of our audience to think about. And then you've got everybody else. But again, we don't have to worry about everybody else most of the time because they'll come along if everybody ahead of them has already chosen that idea. Okay, so a few things to finish up with. Prairie conservation comes with a lot of challenges, just like all conservation. The biggest four here are, the loss of habitat and the fragmentation of habitat into little pieces makes it really hard for species to survive. Climate change obviously is huge. And it's not all the things that you would expect, but things like more droughts, more floods make it harder for land managers to keep everybody happy in those prairies, all those species alive. But also, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually changing the competitive balance between grasses and trees. And so, trees today, because of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, are way more aggressive, way more competitive than they ever have been. And if we allow trees to move into our prairies, they're not prairies anymore. And a lot of those birds and plants won't live there anymore. So we have to try to manage that balance. And it's a lot harder with climate change. We've got a lot of invasive species that sort of simplify the system and push other species out of the way. And that loss of species diversity means a loss of resilience. Each species plays its own role, but there's a lot of overlap between those species. So the more species you have, the more resilient the entire system is. If a species has a bad year, there's others that can come in and fill a very similar role. But really, the biggest challenge we face is that the people don't care. And that's true with conservation in general. There are a lot of people in the world who have much bigger things to think about than conservation of land. But prairies have a special challenge because nobody even knows about prairies, let alone cares about prairies. And so what that means is we don't have the public support for policies that make a big difference. We don't have policies, for example, that uh, make it an economic disadvantage to take a prairie and plow it up and turn it into something else. People can make money doing that, which makes it really hard to keep prairies around. And then in terms of why prairies matter, I spend a lot of time talking about this, right? And I always start with prairies matter because they're prairies. They're amazing. They're fascinating. There's so many amazing stories that are out there. I could tell you hours and hours of stories about why they're really cool. And I think that's the most important place to start when we talk about why prairies are important. And then beyond that, for people who we can't tell those stories to, or for that's not enough, and we can talk about economic things, right? We can talk about ecosystem services that these prairies provide because they are really important for a lot of reasons. Clean air and water, flood control. The city of Houston is using prairies around the city to slow water down during big rain events and prevent flooding of their city. That's a really important function that prairies can provide. Obviously, food production, right? Cattle, especially, are a major protein source for the world. It helps feed the population that we have. Not everybody is a meat eater, and that's fine, but it's still a really important piece of the system. Carbon sequestration, right? And then public recreation. So each of these has a value to it that you can try to create economically. You can kind of put a dollar value on some of these things. Like, clean air and water make maintaining public health cheaper and easier. That's really important. Um, Carbon sequestration, right? We can mitigate a lot of the effects of climate change, which has all these ramifications in terms of stronger hurricanes and flooding in coastal areas, all these other things. Sequestering carbon in grasslands can help mitigate some of those things. But please don't make me defend my prairies with economic values all the time, right? It really gets really hard. And I just wanted to mention this because this is a challenge we think about all the time. There are a lot of people who do want to know what those economic values are, and I'm happy to talk about them. But if a prairie loses half of its plant diversity, uh, it's going to be less resilient, it's going to be less productive, but not in a way that's going to be immediately recognizable. And so it's really hard for me to tell you why plant diversity is important in prairies from an economic standpoint. Where if I tell you that there are these amazing plants that have these incredible stories and they support these pollinators and these predators and all these other things, like that's where the real value is to me. And I can tell that story much more easily that I can try to estimate the value of, what that plant diversity means. Or, for example, um, if you're not grazing a prairie and you're not making an economic income off of is that prairie less valuable to the world than if it is producing a product and providing income for a landowner who can pay property taxes, right? I don't know. Um, and then the one that we're really struggling with now is I just talked about trees. When trees come into a prairie, it's really hard for us to tell you whether that prairie is now going to support or sequester more carbon or less. There are lots of arguments either way. Prairies are great at sequestering carbon, and it's a very stable way because all the carbon goes underground and stays there. Versus with trees, the carbon is in the above ground part of the trees, and then when the trees are cut or burned, then the carbon goes back in, right? But there's still a lot of carbon being pulled out of the air by trees, and it's just a really tricky thing to measure. I don't want to have to make that measurement be the decision about whether we allow trees to take over my prairies, right? So that's where I'm going to end. Hopefully that's interesting and thought-provoking, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
No, this is absolutely great, this conversation. Thank you so much for um, talking about this very, very important topic with
You're
my
welcome.
students. I think in your final talking points about the valuation of prairies, you bring up a lot of important concepts that we covered in our class, which is the time aspect of it, which
Hmm.
part of the value that is being provided by our natural asset, which component are we more focused on, what is the weight that that component is receiving, and these are very, very difficult challenges
Yeah.
that we are, you are on the field working on these kinds of issues. But so these are great. Thank you so much for bringing the life of the prairie to us. I was going to say bringing the prairies to life for us, but that's
Both.
our ignorance to say that bring it to life for us. It's about bringing
That's
the
right.
life to us.
There you go.
So thank you so much, Chris, for this great presentation. I did want to ask you if my students have some follow-up questions. Can I collate them and send them to you
Yes,
to
please.
get
That'd be
some
fun.
responses?
Yep, that'd be a lot of fun.
Great, great. And I would you mind stop? The picture is beautiful. Or do you want to tell a little bit about this picture? Is this?
Sure. This is a picture I took out at my family prairie, actually, which is south of Aurora, Nebraska, where I live. We have about a quarter section of land, about 160 acres that my grandpa bought years and years ago. Um, and this looks like it did or it does because I've done some seeding work out there. I've collected seeds from different plants and threw them out on the ground and tried to get some of the prairie diversity to come back because this most of this site had actually been farmed at one point and my grandpa put it to grass, but it was pretty low diversity, and I've been working for years to try to get more and more plants to show up.
Wow, that is awesome. That is awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, so if you would stop sharing your screen, then our audience will also be able to actually put a face to the name and the voice. But thank
Sure.
you so much, Chris, for your time. We really appreciate you making this amazing presentation. It's
Yep.
awesome.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.